Every human being currently arguing on the internet about identity, ancestry, and where they're really from is, biologically speaking, a few thousand generations removed from the exact same starting point. Same skin, same everything. Let's talk about how that changed. 200,000 years ago, somewhere in East Africa, there's a person standing in tall grass, doing something extremely ordinary, trying to find food without becoming food. No name for their country, no concept of a country, just a person living their one life, completely unaware they're about to become the ancestor of every single human being who will ever exist. If you photographed that person and lined the photo up next to literally anyone walking around today, one thing would jump out immediately. They wouldn't look like most of the people you know. Their skin would be dark, not tanned, not olive, genuinely dark. Because for most of the time humans have existed, everyone's skin looked roughly like that. So here's the obvious question nobody really stops to ask. If we all started out the same color, where did everybody else come from? Because right now, skin tone runs across basically every shade the human body is capable of producing. Some populations went lighter, some stayed dark, some solved the exact same biological problem in two completely different ways without ever meeting each other. And figuring out how that happened is one of the more entertaining detective stories evolution has ever handed us. Let's start with why everyone was dark to begin with. Because it's not random, it's basically a safety setting. Skin gets its color from a pigment called melanin, and melanin's whole job is absorbing ultraviolet radiation before it can shred your DNA. Think of it as a built-in, non-negotiable sunscreen you're issued at birth, no reapplication needed. And near the equator, where early humans spent essentially their entire history, the sun isn't just strong, it's the kind of strong that will quietly damage your cells over a lifetime if you're not protected. And evolution, famously, does not do favors for people who get quietly damaged over a lifetime. So more melanin meant fewer problems. Fewer problems meant more surviving meant more kids, and evolution's entire scoring system, when you strip away all the poetry people like to add to it, comes down to exactly one metric. Did you live long enough to pass your genes on? Nothing about preference, nothing about beauty standards, just an extremely blunt, extremely effective filter running for hundreds of thousands of years. But UV damages cells in general is a little vague as far as evolutionary pressure goes, so let's get specific, because there's one particular molecule at stake that makes the equatorial story make a lot more sense. UV radiation is remarkably good at breaking down folate once it's circulating near the surface of your skin. Folate is not a nutrient you want breaking down. It's directly involved in cell division, in neural tube development for anyone who might end up pregnant, and in maintaining healthy sperm production for anyone who won't. So unprotected skin near the equator wasn't just slowly accumulating sunburn-style damage in the background, it was actively undermining one of the most important reproductive processes on the entire survival checklist, every single day, whether anyone noticed or not. That's a second push in exactly the same direction as the UV damage problem, which is part of why go dark wasn't just the mildly favored answer near the equator, it was the answer being demanded from two completely different directions at once. Here's a fun detail though. You don't actually need thousands of generations to watch a miniature version of this play out. You've been running it yourself every single summer. Tanning is your body performing a live, temporary rerun of the exact same logic. Increased UV exposure tells your melanocytes to ramp up melanin production on the spot, darkening your skin as a short-term defense. And once the sun exposure drops off, the whole thing quietly resets. Same system, same underlying mechanism, just running on a timescale of weeks instead of tens of thousands of years. Which means every beach vacation is, in a very real sense, a condensed rerun of the same story this entire video is about, just compressed down to about 2 weeks and a mildly regrettable pruning phase. And then, somewhere between 60 and 80,000 years ago, groups of humans started walking. Not with maps, not with any plan you'd recognize as a plan, just outward, generation after generation, until people had somehow made it to the Middle East, then Europe, then deep into Asia, and eventually, inexplicably, decided that crossing into a completely different hemisphere sounded like a reasonable weekend. And the further they walked from the equator, the weaker the sunlight got, which sounds like great news at first. Less UV, less cellular damage, problem solved, everybody go home. Except the sun wasn't only causing damage, it was also the only practical way your skin makes vitamin D, a nutrient your bones, your immune system, and basically your entire skeletal structure are quietly begging for on a daily basis. So the same trait that had been an absolute cheat code in Africa became a liability somewhere else. Skin that was excellent at blocking sunlight was now blocking a nutrient that was already in short supply. And slowly, not in one generation, not in 10, but across an almost absurd number of generations, the advantage flipped, and lighter skin started winning in exactly the places where it used to lose. Here's the part that tends to catch people off guard. The first humans who wandered into Europe were not pale. They stayed dark-skinned for a genuinely long time after arriving. We know this because scientists have managed to pull usable DNA out of skeletons thousands of years old, and the results keep surprising people who assumed pale skin just came standard with the continent. Some of these ancient Europeans had dark skin paired with light-colored eyes, a combination that looks less like a documented evolutionary pathway and more like someone hit shuffle on a settings menu. Pale skin as the European default didn't show up until much later, after diets shifted, after farming spread, after certain genetic variants that helped with vitamin D production quietly became more and more common, not because that version was superior, just because it happened to work better under those specific skies. That dark skin, pale eyes combination is worth actually pausing on, because it's not a random coincidence thrown in to make the story stranger. It's a clue about how this whole system actually works. Eye color runs on a version of the exact same pigment, melanin, just deposited somewhere else entirely, the iris. Less melanin in the iris means more light gets scattered back out instead of absorbed, which is what produces blue or green eyes instead of brown. And because the genetics controlling iris pigmentation aren't tightly linked to the genetics controlling skin pigmentation, you can absolutely end up with combinations that look, at first glance, like evolution wasn't paying attention. Dark skin with pale eyes, pale skin with dark eyes. It's not a glitch. It's two separate dials, controlled by mostly separate genetic switches, quietly adjusting on their own separate timelines. Which brings up a smaller, weirder story hiding inside the bigger one. Remember how the cold open mentioned redheads? They're not just extra pale, they're running a completely different piece of hardware. Most of the lightning story so far has been about diving melanin production down. Redheads and the freckled, easily sunburned skin that usually comes with them are the result of a specific variant in a gene called MC1R. And instead of just producing less of the dark, protective pigment, this variant shifts production toward a different pigment entirely, one that leans reddish-yellow and offers dramatically weaker UV protection. Which raises an obvious question. Why would evolution ever favor a worse sunscreen? Because in the specific pockets of the world where this variant became common, think Ireland, Scotland, Scandinavia, sunlight is so weak so much of the year that the priority completely flipped. UV protection stopped being the main event. Squeezing out every last dross of available vitamin D became the actual job. So the redhead in your life isn't a fluke. They're a highly specialized regional tool, built for a climate with almost nothing to work with, who now happens to live in a world with beach vacations. And this next part is honestly the most entertaining detail in the whole story. Europeans weren't the only ones who evolved lighter skin as they moved away from the equator. East Asian populations did too, facing basically the same sunlight problem, landing on basically the same solution. Except when scientists compared the actual genes responsible, they weren't the same genes. Two different populations, dealing with the same environmental pressure, arrived at a similar-looking result through largely separate genetic routes, like two students turning in the same final answer on a test, only to find out they used completely different working to get there. Evolution wasn't following one master blueprint here. It just had more than one tool capable of solving the same problem, and different populations happened to grab different tools. Now, This is usually where people mentally sort everything into three neat categories: dark, light, and Asian, and call it a day. Which is a shame because that's not remotely what actually happened. Human skin tone isn't three boxes. It's a spectrum stretched across an enormous range, shaped by local sunlight, local diets, and thousands of years of small populations moving, mixing, and settling. West African pigmentation isn't identical to North African pigmentation. South Asian populations followed a different path than East Asian populations. Indigenous Australians ended up with their own distinct pattern entirely, shaped by their own specific slice of sunlight. Nobody was following a shared instruction manual. Every population was just quietly solving its own local version of the same equation. Here's where the story stops being just biology and starts being a little bit about us specifically. Back in the 1700s, naturalists like Carl Linnaeus and Johann Blumenbach looked at that spectrum, the one we just spent 10 minutes establishing as continuous, gradual, and shaped by local sunlight, and decided the correct move was to chop it into a small, fixed number of categories, mostly based on skin tone, and treat those categories as if they were as real and stable as separate species. This framework got taught as settled science for the next 2 centuries. It was wrong from the start, and modern genetics is what finally proved it. When researchers actually measured how much genetic variation exists inside a single so-called race versus how much exists between different ones, the variation inside any single group turned out to be larger than the average difference between groups. The boxes were drawn confidently, taught seriously, and built on basically nothing. It's worth pausing on what happens at the very far edge of this whole story, because there's a condition that shows exactly how much work melanin is quietly going behind the scenes. Oculocutaneous albinism is a genetic condition where the body produces little to no melanin at all, regardless of what environment someone's ancestors came from. In regions with intense equatorial sunlight, that absence isn't just a cosmetic difference, it's a serious, ongoing medical vulnerability with dramatically elevated risk of UV-related skin damage and skin cancer, along with vision problems since melanin plays a role in eye development too. Albinism shows up in every population on Earth, but it's particularly high stakes in parts of Africa, where the exact sunlight that ordinarily rewards heavy melanin production is instead relentlessly working against someone whose biology never got the memo. It's a stark reminder that everything we've been describing as a slow, passive evolutionary background story is, for some people, a very immediate, very real daily condition. Which brings all of this from ancient history into something relevant to you personally. Your ancestors spent something like 10,000 generations slowly calibrating their skin to the exact amount of sunlight hitting the specific patch of ground they lived on. Then you were born, and at some point you or your parents or their parents got on a plane, and that 10,000 generation calibration process got completely bypassed in about 9 hours, which is why doctors in low sunlight countries routinely see vitamin D deficiency in populations whose skin is still tuned for the equator, and why dermatologists in some heavy countries like Australia see dramatically higher skin cancer rates in populations whose skin is still tuned for Northern Europe. Nobody's skin is broken. It's just running a setting designed for a completely different postcode. So think back to that person standing in the grass 200,000 years ago, with no idea that Europe existed, no idea Asia existed, absolutely no idea that their descendants would eventually invent international borders, passports, sunscreen, and then argue about all three online. They were just trying to get through the day, and somehow, without meaning to, they became the shared starting point for every skin tone that would ever exist, including the one currently reading this sentence. Every shade you'll ever see on another person is the same experiment, still running, just measured a few thousand generations later. A little more sun here, a little less there, one gene doing it one way in Norway, and a completely different gene doing the same job in Beijing. Not a different story for every group, one story, still being told in slightly different light. If this made you look at the next stranger you pass a little differently, that's kind of the whole point. Subscribe if you want more of these, and I'll see you in the next one.